Hello, this is the GW Books Club. Usually, my good friend Stu from the Miniature Realms YouTube channel and I are taking a look at the original books published by Games Workshop back in the late 80s and early 90s. But in this bonus episode, we're reading something really special. Riders of the Dead by Dan Abnett. This is a Warhammer Fantasy novel that's set at the very beginning of the Storm of Chaos during the 6th edition of the Warhammer Fantasy game. And it's an incredible read. So, before we get into our discussion of the book, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the story. As the Empire rallies to defend its lands from a huge Chaos invasion, a unit of Demi-Lancer cavalry arrives late at the forward encampment on the Kislev border. Separated by their orders, two old friends and rivals, the well-read, low-status Clarion Karl Rayner Vollen and the arrogant, entitled standard-bearer Gerlach Heilman, experience the first battle of their young lives, and it is brutal. Gerlach, along with the rest of the unit, join the Empire forces on the field of battle, in the midst of an ambush by the ravening hordes of Chaos. Despite giving a good accounting for himself, Gerlach is one of the few Demi-Lancers to survive the battle, rescued from certain death by a unit of Kislevite winged lancers, and he even manages to save their battle standard in the process, despite losing his own. Vollen had joined the unit's captain in reporting to the general at the army base camp before the battle, but the ambush had fallen on the HQ as well, and despite Vollen's valiant efforts, he was captured by the Northmen horde. Both Gerlach and Vollen experience incredible hardships in the ensuing months. Gerlach is led by the Kislevites on a retreat out of the Empire, with the intention of rejoining the battle against Chaos later on. On his journey, Gerlach is dubbed Vebla by his allies, and though he is resistant at first, he slowly comes to understand and respect the ways of his newfound friends. Realizing that their habits, culture, and tactics have been born from the hard life they must live on the Kislev Oblast. Vollen, meanwhile, is threatened constantly with death and corruption, and is forced to fight his fellow captives in the blood sports of the Northers. Proving himself an unwilling but blessed combatant, Vollen is renamed Azyatzin by his captors and believed to be a chosen of their chaos god Char, an aspect of Tzeentch. In time, Vollen is corrupted by these actions, and he begins to lose his hope and himself, eventually joining and rising to lead members of this chaos horde. The two men, once brothers in battle, take wildly different journeys during the early days of this Chaos invasion, one that would presage an even greater storm of chaos, but eventually they find themselves on the same battlefield. However, now they stand on opposite sides. Stu, we are together again for a bit of a bonus GW Books Club this month, where we're talking about not a GW book, but a Black Library book, Riders of the Dead by Dan Abnett. This was, I was going to say it's a recent book, but it's not at all, right? This came out many years ago, around 2003, I think. And it tells this tale of the beginning of the Storm of Chaos. So what was the original sort of version of the end times. How did you get on with this book? What was your sort of initial impression of it?
It's great. I think it's really good. But I'm a huge Abnett fan, so I kind of went into it with fairly high expectations anyway. So yeah, I have a positive outlook on his writing anyway, and I don't think there's anything he's written that I haven't liked. I don't love everything he's written, but I do love a lot of what he's written. And a lot of this is very classic Abnett. He's very good at keeping the pace just about right. There's not any real dips in it where you think, this is dragging a little bit or it's lost its way. I don't think there's any points there in this. His character writing is great. It's not overcomplicated, but you understand characters and their motivations relatively quickly in stories, and he's able to introduce people for short periods, but you still get a really good feeling for them and what they're about. Mm-hmm. They're not just names on a page. Yeah. And he's just, I've probably said this in shows that we've done before, and I've definitely said it on podcasts when I've talked about his Horus Heresy writing and things. He's just great at writing from a human perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously a focus of a human-based story like this one, but he's very, very good at making it relatable and understandable and giving it a kind of a movie feel and pace. Yeah. And if I was to, if you wanted to make a Amazon series that was Warhammer based, and you wanted to introduce the old world and Chaos as Games Workshop's big bad, this would work as a film or a 10-part series really, really well. You could do it. The script, you could almost break it down into segments. So yeah, loved it in that sense. What about you?
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything you said. Now, so I'm going to start here by just making a little confession, right? Which may well get a few comments, but I've never read any Dan Abnett books before reading this. And so I went in, obviously I'm aware of Abnett's work. I'm aware of how influential it is, how important it's been across 40K, especially, but even outside of Games Workshop, an incredibly successful and incredibly important genre writer. So I went in with a level of expectation, but no personal experience. And I absolutely adored this book. The experience of reading it was incredible. I found it was moving at times. It was triumphant at times and heroic and sad, tragic, exciting. It was really, really good. And I completely agree with what you say about he's writing from the human perspective. So, I mean, the story structurally is quite interesting. It's ultimately a very simple tale, right? It's two young officers in the Pistoliers Regiment, the Demi-Lancers in the Empire. They're going to the front where they think they're then going to have a sort of very orderly engagement with Chaos. They end up getting ambushed before they even get there, and they're separated. And then you follow these two separate sort of friends and rivals who have completely different experiences of the start of the Storm of Chaos, the spring driving, as it's called. So the arrival of Chaos through Kislev into the Empire. One has this sort of almost 13th Warrior or Dances with Wolves kind of story, very cinematic, where he's rescued by the Kislevites and then sort of goes on a journey where he sort of discovers that they're not the savages he thought they were, and he sort of respects them and learns about them and goes on that journey. The other guy, well, he has a really rough time. It's brutal, and but they're such human stories, really, really good. Yeah.
It's just it's really gritty and visceral. And you talk about the start. It's got that kind of, it's got elements of, you imagine people going off to war at the beginning of the First World War, beginning early Second World War, where that kind of we'll be home in a couple of weeks mentality. It's almost a boy's holiday, and then the reality of what war really is and really means. So you managed to weave that into it, and they're almost two stories in one, but they work so well. He could have written two separate stories, and I don't think it'd be anywhere near as good. But you could have just had an elongated story on either one of these two characters. But the fact that they're having such different experiences really enhances the opposite always. And I think, again, the pacing all the way through, swapping between the two characters, it just feels like it's right each time. You feel like, oh, I wonder if that, because there's lots of small paragraphs and there's small mini chapter type things within the larger chapters. And you think, it feels like the next chapter is going to be about Gerlach now. Oh, it is, because you get so used to his writing and the way he's going to deliver this story to you and the pacing. And it's predictable, but in a kind of, it just feels right kind of way.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, and it's a Gerlach. He is the guy he's like the bannerman, right, for the regiment, and he's the one who gets rescued by the Kislevites. And there's a really cool moment later on where you discover the reason they came back to rescue him was because of his heroic act in charging into basically a certain death. And then they rallied because they thought maybe that will bring other surviving units back in, but nobody else came because there was nobody else. So that's why they fled and go off back into Kislev. And then the other character, so Kurt Rainer Vollen, he is the clarion, the sort of bugle, the musician. And he was dispatched just before the battle even begins. He was dispatched to go and have this conversation with the general in the HQ, but it's already fallen by the time they get there, and that's why his journey goes off in a completely different space. But just looping back around to what you said about that, going off to war kind of feel at the start, it's so effective in that. You really do get this, they're all the sort of, because they're young soldiers, they're unproven. There's like one guy who tells war stories, and it's
Yeah.
because he was like near a battle once, so he's the closest thing they've got to someone who actually has seen combat.
Yeah.
And they're sick and tired of drills. They can't wait to get into combat. Even, I mean, Gerlach actually almost starts a fight with the Kislevites that they run into on the road, who ultimately end up saving him later on, because he's just eager for a fight, and he thinks these guys are just like dirty Kislevite guys. We don't care about them. We're fancy Imperial guys. Let's just fight them.
Yeah.
And obviously, you find out later on how foolish that would have been. But you get a real sense of Gerlach as just he is very impulsive and aggressive, and he's a bit of a jerk as well. To they're not really friends because he's from money and Volan's from nothing.
Yes.
Which is really stings, and we'll sort of come back to what really happens to Volan, but it's rough because the guy who's a jerk kind of gets the better end of the tail, I suppose. It's not that it's great. I mean, no one has a good time in this novel, but he doesn't go through what Volan does at the hands of being a chaos prisoner.
Yeah, they both go on journeys, and I suppose Volan's journey was from having no power to a place of power. So he does actually succeed. Yes, his end isn't great. And if you compare the start to the end, you think, yeah, this was probably the more likable guy, and that ends up with the sad ending. If you forget the gods he's fighting for, whether they're good or bad or whatever, you can see the journey he goes on, and these Northmen, these Norska are normal men as well that come from a different part of the old world. Yes, they're worshipping chaos gods, but partly by their location, by their geography, really. Well, the northern wastes are their closest borders. If their peoples were in a different part of the old world, it would be a different story. They are men, as in the race of men, men of the old world that happen to live in the north, and they're more brutal kind of life, but they're also traders as well. They also have happiness and joy. They have, they enjoy eating and all these things. Are just more of a savage kind of point in their timeline and existence. And so they feel human to you. They don't feel like caricature, evil chaos warrior in a black armor that's almost like a space marine, that they've gone so far into the kind of the caricature of chaos. And then I suppose the journey for Gerlach is that kind of, he's young and hot-headed and arrogant, but a lot of that's to do with his upbringing as well. And he learns those hard lessons, and that's more of a stereotypical kind of movie journey, isn't it? Whereas the other one's more of an offbeat journey.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, actually, just about how, because there's a lot within this book about how your birth and your environment in which you're born and raised does influence your opportunities within this world. So you see that literally through the kind of armor that the demi-lancers can afford and can wear, and what roles they're allowed to have within the unit, even though they're all sort of technically, you might think they're all equals. Well, they're not, because some of them have come from nobility and have got more options and are automatically going to be more senior. And then you also see, as you say, that sort of same, how does the caste system work and how do the tribes work of these Northers? And so much of it is a result of where they're born, the opportunities that they have, like you say, which gods they're end up worshipping, why they're so brutal. Same again for the Kislevites, and how so much of what they do and how they think is tied to the culture in which they were born and raised, and sort of, how they fight is then driven by that as well. And I think it's really, really effective at sort of exploring those different perspectives. Here's how the Empire goes to war, and here is why they go to war in that way. Here's how the Kislev soldiers go to war and how they assemble for a battle, and why. Here's how the Chaos Marauders go. But because they're a culture and because they're sort of drawn out as a society by Abnett, they're humanized in a really interesting way. They aren't just this amorphous sort of block of infantry, there's characters amongst them and there's agendas amongst them, and they fight amongst themselves. They come together to fight the Empire
There's
together.
brotherhood there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's loads
the
of
real
really interesting stuff in it. Yeah, I mean, it's really effective at that. I was very worried early on, sort of going into the book, about, well, how are you going to make anybody care about chaos and bad guys? Sure, and because we'll get into it, but like the way they treat Volin is horrendous. It's really affecting. Like, as reading some of that stuff is really brutal. How am I going to care about any of these guys? These are evil, horrible guys. And yes, they are, and it never shies away from that. But it does also make them into more rounded, interesting characters, I think.
Definitely. I think the main reason he's likable is because he is from the beginning, and the parts you don't like about him, it almost feels like they're out of his control. He is slowly changed by circumstance, which wasn't down to his choosing, and the way is obviously captured, but also the way he was treated and the brutality and what he had to do to survive. But then also the underlying taint of Zinch, or the chaos gods in general, that slowly change him. There's elements through it where he doesn't realize that he's understanding the Norse language. He thinks he's still hearing Reichspiel when he's speaking the Norse language. But he thinks he's speaking Reichspiel because he's been imbued with this chaos taint, and he doesn't realize that he is changing. And so it's almost out of his control. So you end up feeling sorry for him rather than hating him as this awful, tainted chaos savage. You see, well, it was inevitable what happened to him. So you just feel sorry for him.
Let's talk about Volin's experiences then, actually, because so he, like you say, he gets captured, and then he's going to go through a lot of bad stuff. The descriptions of how the Chaos Marauders sort of treat their captured soldiers or the enemy, that's really brutal. These are prisoners who are like lying on top of the bodies. It's really super grim. But then again, Abnett's sort of humanizing moments within that. There was a bit that it was quite affecting for me, actually, was where they're sort of they're treating all of the prisoners badly, and they're killing some prisoners, and they're taking some to one side. And Kurt Volin is sort of protected at one point by a big sort of burly engineer, one of the cannon engineers, who's also been captured. And he just sort of he keeps him up, he keeps him stood up all night, so he doesn't have to like lie down on the bodies, and he sort of hugs him, and then you later on find out that the reason he sort of did that small act of kindness, even though they'd had crossed words earlier, was because he's got a son, and Volin reminds him of the son, and and then they get dragged off and separated, and the engineer he shouts for him, like, and sort of calls out his name, and so does the knight who is also there, the Knight's Panther who's been captured. These little relationships, these little moments of supporting one another in the worst possible circumstances, with certain death around the corner, they're still like human and noble. They were really powerful moments, I thought. And there's a real sadness when they get separated and pulled apart. It's
the tension's
rough,
there. It's like any film you've seen where someone's going to be killed, and they realize that moment they're going to be killed, whether it's a war film and it's something horrible like a concentration camp, or whether it's I don't know. I was thinking of a film I saw the other day where a Australian tourists were captured for drug smuggling in Thailand, and I think it's a true story. There's one of the girls was mentally handicapped, was Down syndrome, and they were machine gunned, and it's kind of that moment of pure kind of terror when they realize that they're going to be put to death. And it kind of carried that kind of feeling to it, and the pure desperation. These men knew that their lives were gone. We're going to be killed, but and in a painful way as well. We're going to be tortured versus that complete kind of mental degradation you would have in that situation of being stacked in a cage with layers of bodies of people that are just conscious the just alive people taken from the battlefield, stacked in a cage, and the people down the bottom were slowly suffocating and dying, and living in those kind of really gruesome, horrific, well, those kind of descriptions you don't normally find in a Warhammer novel. You can imagine
Yeah.
it, the chaos, but Abnett's was, we went for it here. This
He
is
did.
war, and this is
Yeah.
grim.
Really grim.
And
But it
it
doesn't
made it
feel.
visceral, but it
Yeah.
doesn't feel over the top. No, there's
No,
not
I
too
agree.
much gore in it. It sounds worse describing it than it actually
Sure.
reads. But like you said, the emotion that's there and that kind of feeling of, yes, this would be horrible, is there, but it's done without being too gratuitous, if that works.
I agree. Yeah, because I think it adds a lot to like the way that these guys work. So it creates this there is a tension and there's this horrible sickness in your stomach reading some of that stuff. It is brutal and horrid, but it's also part of like building up what's going to happen to Kurt. It's taking him to one of these super low ebbs, taking him to this darkest place possible. But at the same time, there's also method in the madness of the Chaos Marauders. They're doing these things for specific reasons. So they have to make sacrifices to Char, as they call him, Zinch.
Yeah.
So there's actually rituals that are going on. There's also loads of status stuff as well, which I thought was fantastic, where you get certain prisoners are marked by certain senior leaders within the Chaos Forces because they're going to be champions in the pit fights. Or there's one guy who Volin had injured earlier in the battle, and then he wants revenge, so he's like, I'm going to swear a blood oath against that guy. So you kind of get all of these different agendas and politics happening behind the scenes as well, and that's really good. I'm just reminded there of in that moment when he injured that particular character who's a shaman, that was because Volin had been sent to defend the general.
Yes.
During the battle, everything's gone south, and there's a couple of really noble general's guard who are trying to fight off the chaos at the front of the house, and the general's up in the room, and the guy who's being dragged down and being overwhelmed says to Volin, "You've got to go and save the general. If there's one thing you can do to help, it's save the general." And so Volin goes off and tries to find him, and finds that he's already dead. This shaman guy's already killed him. And then there's this sort of almost this like internal laughter that Volin has of just like, these noble guys defending the door so that the general can escape don't even realize that it's already too late. And that's kind of Volin's whole story. It's already too late for him.
Already too late. And
it's
that
rough.
was set up so well as well. And this is a really almost unimportant part of the story, but I think this illustrates the layers that Abnett will build in. You've met that general in a few scenes beforehand, and he is, think of every tough British officer in a sharp film or TV series that you've met, or Hornblower, or whatever, that over the top, slightly drunken kind of, you're all stupid, blah, blah, blah. He's really kind of visceral and bright and slightly amusing, and you roll your eyes at him. And you think, well, okay, that was good. And again, a character with a lot of flavor when he could have just been in there for a few lines. But it makes the point when he goes back to him, because you're kind of expecting him to be that same person again. Yeah. But he's not. He's on the floor. He's dead. Yeah. And I think that it's really subtle and only a small amount, but there are little payoffs like that all the way through from those style of writing that just really kind of makes each, well, again, it's like a film scene. Each thing's a little short film scene, like they're like cuts, aren't they? And to the next picture, the next picture. And it just adds so much to it and keeps your interest and helps that momentum of the story keep going, I think.
It really does, yeah. And it wrong-footed me that as well, actually, because I thought, because we'd seen that Volin, and obviously this is intentional, that Volin was the sort of learned, nicer guy out of the two, with Gerlach being a bit of, like you say, a hothead and arrogant and a bit cruel. It kind of feels like, well, the cruel guy should go to chaos then, and the nice guy should be the hero. And no, it doesn't play that way. So I thought he was going to get the general, and that was his story. He'd go back to the Empire, and then sort of, that's sort of how his story was going to progress. But no, he's captured and goes through all of this stuff. And over the course of the novel, he then becomes a champion of chaos. So he's put in the pits, and he has to fight these different different selected prisoners that other warlords have chosen from the crop of prisoners they've captured. And then they are pitted against each other, to sort of elevate the status of the warlords, and Volin does really well. And then that starts to get him a bit more freedom. And then because he doesn't, there's one bit when he briefly sort of considers escape, but it's fruitless, and he realizes that, so he just goes back. And then that kind of builds up the trust in him, and he goes up the ranks from within, but it never feels like forced. The pace is just right, and the level of trust is just right, and the level of suffering that he has to go through is right. So he doesn't get an easy ride, but he does feel like he succeeds and earns the sort of, the dark gifts that he gets.
Exactly. And the way, again, that horror of because at this point they are captive, some are killed, they're technically slaves. These fights are proxy battles for these different kind of chieftains within the Norsca army to almost have fights to get status, but also do it without risking being killed themselves.
Sure,
and these prisoners are also people that are starting to form a bond together.
Yeah.
They might not have eaten for days, or they're meager food, and they've learned a little bit about each other. They found out their names, where they were, what regiments, what they hope to go back to. And when they're told to fight, they're like, I don't want to fight him. I don't want to fight him. And there's all those moments where, well, I'm going to have to fight, or if I don't kill you, you're going to kill me. And there's those moments all the way through like that. And I think that helps you keep the sympathy with him and almost masks his change into a chaos warlord, because you still see him as this man connected to humanity all the way through. So not only is he still trying to do the right thing, he doesn't realize that he's slowly being tainted and changed. And without that, if it was more, I don't know, 1980s film, and he was just Conan in it in all of the fight scenes, is like, I know what, I'm going to become a warlord now because I'm the best fighter. But it's not about him being the best fighter. It's about that journey of survival, really, and not realizing that the whole time it's almost like his destiny's been laid out for him.
Yeah, and that's the sort of the cruel hand that Tzeentch deals him throughout the course of the novel. There is another prisoner there as well, the Night Panther I mentioned. So von Murger, who is he's been hit in the head, he's been blinded, and he's sort of really, there's a certain level of respect that he has because he's a knight and he's a great hero. He's known to some of the other prisoners as being a great hero of the Empire. And you kind of, maybe this guy's going to help them escape. Maybe there's going to be something here. But he goes on his own journey and sort of, diverges from Volin and comes back later on. But he slowly starts to receive his own gift from Tzeentch, and he can sort of understand things and see things. And one of the things he says is that, you're ultimately going to kill me, Volin. Even though
it's just quite early on, doesn't he?
He does. It's really early on, and it's delivered in a really in a good way. I mean, a lot of you could argue that where else is the story going to go for Volin? He's not it's told with a level of, obviously it's a fantasy setting, but with a level of realism that makes it clear this is not, Volin's not going to get a sword and fight his way out of the prison camp, because he's in the middle of the entire horde of chaos.
Yeah.
So that you sort of, there's a degree of understanding where this story is going to go. True, but even with that kind of like prophecy, it doesn't ever feel sort of overly predictable that we're going to get to that place. You can sort of get a sense of, well, they're probably going to pit fight at some point, but it kind of comes about in a really interesting way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the way to sum it up. And a lot of his writing, to be honest with you get the grim feeling of, in this case, a fantasy story within a real war setting, like a real gritty war film, rather than a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy-esque film where you know to expect almost movie-esque kind of scenes, and it's a lot more kind of entertainment kind of view. And I know this isn't a movie, this is a book, but again, it's just, if you read his writing, you'll know why I keep bringing it up, because they just read like
very
films,
cinematic,
don't they? Yeah. And I think that for me, they are all gritty war films. But so they're really, the fantasy's there and you can guess what's going to happen, but it's got an element of realism to it, or it feels like realism, that really kind of adds that kind of depth and almost
Yeah.
despair to it sometimes.
Oh, absolutely despair for sure. But yeah, I definitely felt that early on in the way that he was. So I've not really read a lot of like historical war
Mm,
fiction, I suppose. But it felt like
yeah,
a historical battle, the way in which we were lining up the units and the way in which they worked on the battlefield and how the
yeah.
ambush worked. And so you get this real sense that this is like a sort of logical, functioning world where
Mm,
having a unit of infantry does this in a battle versus a unit of cavalry. And here's how those things interact on the battlefield. And then that works really well, I think, to then it draws you in. I mean, there's a book called the Red Badge of Courage by
hmm
Stephen Crane, which is about the American Civil War, and so
yeah,
he hadn't ever actually been to war, but he sort of imagined it, and it's incredibly effective at
yeah,
sort of telling the story of what it's like to be, or what I assume it would be like to be on those front lines, and that felt it was very reminiscent of that, I thought, and it had a
yes,
sort of similar
yes.
level of realism, fictionalized because the author just invented it, but he did a great job of inventing something that felt very real. And that's what this does, I think.
Yeah, actually made a note about that. So similar kind of thing, and it's made me think of others as well. But it's little bit like, again, movie reference, but some of the scenes when they're describing the different empire regiments from the different provinces and things, it's a little bit like the early scenes in Waterloo, the famous 1960s version, not the latest Napoleon film. It feels like those scenes where you imagine the camera panning across the landscape and focusing in on, it's a cannon crew getting the gun in position, another one checking their muskets, and it feels like that
Yeah.
kind of thing. We're introducing you to these different regiments and these different kind of characters within this vast movie on this massive battlefield. You get a real feeling of scope and size. And you mentioned American Civil War, the Gettysburg films like that, and that's come from a very, very famous book as well. They're really, really good books, but we won't go into that here. But exactly that kind of thing, though. Really, you just feel like you're deliberately kind of giving you the scope and the size that this big battle. It felt
Yeah.
like this is a huge thing. The
Yeah.
skirmishes in
Massive.
this, but that first battle before the first setup was like the early scenes of the big Napoleon. I know it's not be medieval
Sure.
or type battle, but it feels that kind of size.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And then, well, let's sort of go in the other direction then. So from that battle, we get Gerlach Heilman, who is the banner bearer. The unit is decimated. It's him and two other guys. They're going to quit the field and then actually decide, you know what? No, let's charge back in and we're just going to fight to the death, essentially. And they
Yes.
lose their banner. People get injured. The Kislevites come in and the Wing Lancers actually come in and save the day. And then Gerlach manages to pick up their banner because their bannerman has fallen, and they ride off through the forest. They're pursued, and they ride off and make their way back into Kislev. All the time, Gerlach is like, "We need to turn around. We need to regroup with the Empire forces. We need to get back into the battle." He's not really given a lot of information, and his fellow soldiers from the Demi-Lancers unit, they pass away, and so it's just him, and he doesn't understand the language, he doesn't understand the customs, he doesn't understand how they work as a unit or as an army. But it becomes apparent over time that the Kislevites are actually regrouping further back, quite far away, but they're going to see who survived, and then if there's enough of them, come back and circle around and sort of get involved again and fight the chaos
Yes.
from behind. So that story the sort of journey he goes on, obviously very different and a very different perspective, and he's treated in a very different. There's a lot of real kindness that he gets to experience, but he's sort of too angry and guilty and upset to appreciate a lot of that kindness, at least at first. But he also goes on this journey of beginning to understand what's to him a very alien culture, but he sort of starts to grow to respect it and then embrace it and then succeed within it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's a very stereotypical aristocratic kind of based character, but with for all of his faults, and maybe this is a fault as well, but that kind of underlying want to do the right thing. My job is that Vexilia, my flag, that's my job. I've lost my honor. So it's all about the honor before sensible action. And that's very apparent all the way through it. But it lessens more. And his journey, I suppose, is one of maturity, one of
Mm.
understanding there is another way. And you have to go learn the hard way to kind of become more experienced and be more effective, which is kind of what happens, even though I suppose at the end he gets to do what he wants to do all along, which is get his revenge and charge in again to battle. And I suppose he does get his revenge, but not against the person he was originally expecting to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and it's bittersweet in a way when that revenge does come. But yeah, he learns that you kind of have to go, or sometimes you have to go around to go through a problem. So rather than just charge back in and all die, as he himself had done on the battlefield, he didn't. There's no discretion is the better part of valor. There's no let's regroup and fight again another day, and that's the best way to serve the Empire. At that initial point, he is just, well, I'm supposed to have a fight, so that's what I'm going to do, even if it won't benefit anyone.
Yeah.
Whereas the Kislevites understand that life is hard, and they're the way that they live out in the Oblast and the plains of Kislev. You have to work for everything, and you have to be as very innovative and creative way of getting water and food and society. But because it's so hard to get, you have to value it and you have to make the most of it. So they teach him that over the course of his journey. He becomes way more understanding of, the value of life and the value of doing these things that at first seem really weird to him. Why would you retreat all the way back into Kislev? Oh, well, actually, it's because that's where everybody else is going to be. And why would you ride in this way? Why would you use your armor in this way? This is some really interesting stuff, again, from a sort of human perspective around the fact that when they first encountered those Kislevite cavalry members, they were all wearing their sort of ragged riding clothes and dirty, and they didn't look like the noble heroes that they'd been told the winged lancers were. They didn't look like the demi-lancers of the Empire who were wearing their fine regalia all the time. And it's because the Kislevites, they can't afford to have a load of gear. It's so important that you only put it on when you're going to use it. And and it's a really valuable artifact, the armor that they wear. So stuff like that was really, really good, I thought.
Yeah, really well written. Even little callbacks on that. There's a throwaway line, really, I suppose, about speaking about the absurdity. They know they're getting into battle, so there's a point where they all stop and they've all got off their horses and they strip off to put the stuff on before they can go and do it. And again, you think, well, it's not something you need in a story, but it's done in such a good way that it just, again, adds to that kind of realism and reality of it. And it's you use the wrong words to describe the same scene there. It would just seem odd in the story, but it doesn't at all. It's got a good point, well made. But I wonder if some of the journey he goes on is because he's so hot-headed and everything's quick and angry and at pace. And because he can't understand them, he loses the first point of communication that we all have, which is language. So he has to take a step back and repeat things and try different ways. And that whole communication gets slowed down then. So there's more time for him to think. Sometimes he can't express himself or can't understand what they mean. And he's stuck with them because he's that or he's on his own. So he's got a lot of time for sort of introspection there, and also to kind of watch them and learn from them before he can converse with them and fully understand. And I think that's symbolized by they give him a nickname, which is Verblo, I think.
Verblo, yeah.
And it basically means lamb because he's impetuous and always shouting, and he doesn't find out what it means till the end. And I think that little mini story there, that nickname they give him, kind of sums that up, as he's not that anymore. He's not that noisy, impetuous, excited, angry, I want this now person. He's learned over the time through the lessons that he has he learns more lessons with them as well. But those things that he learns when he's with them just teaches him to be a bit more rounded. And it'd be interesting to see how the character would go on. Well, maybe it would be too cheesy now. Now he's too calm and heroic. Maybe you wouldn't want more stories about him. But it's
Well, yeah.
definitely
Well, I think it would have been super interesting to sort of continue the narrative further. I mean, there's a moment that I really liked where so the Kislevites, they rub their horses down after a day of riding with straw, just to I assume it breaks down whatever acids in the muscles and all that sort of stuff. So just general horse care. And there's a moment when when Gerlach, he realizes that he's sort of just on instinct or habit is now rubbing down his horse using the straw rather than the brush that he has in his pack, which would normally be what the Empire troopers would use. And I quite like that. It's just a sort of slow, the habit forming thing of just immersed in this culture, and that sort of slightly, that kind of, he just acclimatizes to it and it becomes very natural to him. And it obviously mirrors what's happening with Volin over in the Chaos Marauders camp, where he's slowly, subconsciously just absorbing the culture that he's within, and that then changes his behaviors as a result. But for Gerlach, it was really interesting. And then there's also things like his horse gets painted and by the local kids, and then he sort of retains, they dyed the horse, and he sort of retains that. There's also some really nice stuff with reading the clouds and sort of getting a sense of what the gods might want to happen next. And there's quite a poignant thing that will come up later where if a rider has traveled for so long and seen so many clouds that he sees the same shape in the clouds again, then that means his time has come, and that's the end of his life. So there's really nice little moments of like, this is what it's like to be amongst the Kislev people in the Warhammer world. It paints in so much culture and interesting stuff that you don't always get to see, in the sort of slim army book they did, Free with White Dwarf, or in a single unit of Lancers in an Empire armies book, or whatever it might be. It just adds so much to them as a faction,
customs and greetings, and which hand you have your toasting drink in, and all these things. A lot of it's obviously taken from real historical cross references there. So we've got fermented milk drinks and all those kind of things, but to see it all there just again adds to that kind of feeling of realism and history rather than just fantasy story. And it's really good, isn't it, for that?
Yeah, it's great. It's really, really effective for that. And you mentioned the Vebla, the name that they all give him, and that he doesn't find out until the very end. He asked one question earlier on, and Beledny, the leader of the Kislevite troop, who's been really kind and really patient with Gerlach, thinks he's going to ask him what Vebla means, but he actually asks him. Or it might be another member of the troop, but whoever he is asking, why are you called the Riders of the Dead? Why is that what you guys call each other? And it's because they essentially mourn for the unit whenever it leaves the village. Yeah. Because if you're riding to battle in the Warhammer world, the chances are you're not coming back.
You might not come back.
You have to accept that this is your last ride. And your family and your friends accept that this is your last ride and that you won't be coming back. And then that means that if you do, that's amazing. That's great. But if you don't, it's already understood. So that was really interesting. I don't know if that's from any real kind of culture or anything like that. One thing that did strike me as interesting, and I mentioned it before with the 13th Warrior, a film which is based on Beowulf. And that's actually inspired by Beowulf, but based on a story by Michael Crichton called The Eaters of the Dead. And that's about the essentially Chaos Marauders and they're cannibal marauders. I didn't know if there was any kind of connection there, but some of the stuff within that about how Chaos Marauders work and the culture and the society is very present in this book. Eaters of the Dead, Riders of the Dead. I don't know if there was something there, but it was interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely see that. It's a good film. People haven't been in it.
Yeah,
good film. But I really like those layers anyway. I like the journey he goes on. It's a little bit more straightforward, I suppose, and cinematic. You feel that he's more aware of his learning and his change as he goes. He's a
Yeah.
little bit more, yeah, okay, yeah, I've learned a lesson here, I've learned a lesson there. Whereas for poor old Carl, things kind of happened to him, and when he does realize it's too late at that point,
Yeah.
there's no coming back. It's gone to past the point where
Yeah, there is
he can change.
an interesting thing with his name. So I think Gerlach understands that he's being called Vebla. He understands that it's a nickname, and he doesn't much care. And ultimately, he kind of embraces it by the end, in a way. Kurt Vollen is once he starts to be successful, is called Azyatzin.
Yeah, I'm glad you went for that rather than me.
By
I've not said that out loud. It's all been in my head. Yeah, he's given that name and almost refuses it, doesn't he? To start
he
with,
does.
He
he's
says,
like,
no, I'm Carl. He's like, no.
Yeah, is it? I forget whether it's Carl or Kurt.
I think it's Carl, isn't it?
But he retains the K. He wants the K name. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be called Azyatzin.
It's a special K.
Yeah, yeah. And he resists it for a very long time until towards the end when he sort of embraces that himself. And he goes full chaos at that point.
He goes full chaos. I've gone full chaos. But he's. I think there's a point where he's looking at his battlefield opponents now, which is the Empire Army. At the point when he realizes he doesn't recognize, he can see all the banners, but doesn't recognize any of them all. Can't place their names. He realizes that his memory is being changed by Tzeentch. It's been erased. It's easier for him to come to terms with who he is now by making him forget things, making him forget his old life.
Yeah.
And there's lots of little interesting bits, like the bit I said earlier about not realizing what language he's listening
I love
speaking
that.
in.
It's a great moment.
And this is another moment like that where he doesn't realize that he's already changed. Other people are noticing it, and he does. There's another bit where he's listening to them talking in Norska, and he makes a comment to another slave or prisoner. Well, you know what they said. How do you understand them? And it's like, well, they're talking, aren't they? Well, no, they're talking in Norska. And he's like, they're talking in Wrightspell, aren't they? No, only you can understand them. And it's like, how's he learned that? It's just little subtle bits like that all the way through. So it's very much happening to him rather than lessons being learned.
Yeah, it's a sad story.
He's the puppet rather than the student, I suppose.
Yeah. There is later on, because they end up wintering actually in Kislev. And again, this was something that worked really well in the novel, I think. You get the sense that moving armies around the Empire and a massive invasion, it doesn't happen overnight. And you still have to move these people around. You still have to feed everybody. They have to get from place to place. And then, during the winter, they have to take shelter somewhere because you can't really campaign during the winter. So they go to a chaos sanctuary or a temple that's in sort of the Kislev sort of mountains. And there's other chaos factions there, other marauder factions there. And that is where we get this sort of final confrontation between Vollen, now Azyatzin, and Von Merger, the knight, the blind knight, who's become a champion of a different warlord. They have a little moment where they get to talk to each other, and then there is an attempt to kill Vollen and to assassinate him because he's giving too much power to his chieftain. Yeah, and because he's he's blessed by Tzeentch now. He's able to defeat these guys in the shrine, and then his own chieftain comes in, the guy who's kind of sponsored him this whole time, who was who defeated him in their first encounter way back at the start of the book. And he now realizes that actually Vollen is more powerful than the warlord who he's been pledged to this whole time, and then just takes him out and becomes the new warlord and the new chieftain of that particular sort of sect of the Marauders. And all of that stuff plays out. It's so, again, I don't want to say that it is predictable. It's kind of, it feels inevitable. Yes. It seems like it's essential that this is where the story must go, but it still plays out in an exciting and really compelling way. It
Yes.
doesn't just you're not just painting by numbers when you get to this point. It feels like this point has to happen, but it's still great when you do arrive at it. And I think that that's a real
Yeah.
testament to
And it
Abnett's
all
writing.
happens quite quickly because, yeah, they go to this camp thing, which is, I don't know, it's like a conference, isn't it? All the different factions get together.
Yeah,
They've all got their lanyards on,
yeah.
and some factions are like it's like a party conference. We'll take it no further than that. Different factions are vying for who's going to be the most powerful. They're doing a bit of schmoozing in the feasting hall. Having a bit of a chat, but ultimately, very, very quickly, he knows he's in danger, and his riders are watching his back. But he gets tempted to the shrine by the shaman of his own warlord, and he's pushing back on this all the time, isn't he? He doesn't want to go because he knows that to
Going to
go
the
to the
shrine
shrine would
embraces
potentially
chaos.
embracing and giving
Yeah.
in to Zinch, which he doesn't want to do. And he's already met the overall war leader, who's this weird kind of Master Blaster esque kind of
Fantastic.
thing
Yes.
going on,
He's Krang
and he
from the
just pushes back.
Turtles.
Yeah, that's a better one.
But in a fantastic fantasy Warhammer way. He's Krang. It's
Yes.
great.
It's good fun. So he doesn't want that, but it almost goes when he gets taken to the shrine. He realizes at this point, he gets his sight back. We haven't mentioned he lost an eye when he nearly died at one point. He lost an eye, gets given his sight back, even though his eye's not there. So he's got some kind of chaos sort of sense sight, which the ex what's his, I've forgotten his name now. We mentioned too many. Von
Varmoga.
Yes. So he ends up fighting him, and
Mm.
the prophecy is that he will kill him. But the only person that can kill Carl is someone who can't see, and this guy's happens to be blind, has been seen by his own chaos sight for some time, but he still kills him.
Yep.
And it's there's all these little kind of Easter eggs are there all the way through that come together quite quickly. And at that point, he's just like, well, I'll have to be the best then. And he is this kind of becomes this war leader very, very quickly. And it wasn't inevitable that he would become the leader of his tribe, so to speak. I suppose it was inevitable. Quite early on, you could see the path that he was going to become a chaos warrior of some renown, but how far up that sort of list, and people are genuinely scared of him, aren't they? At the end, yeah, it just didn't last very long for him in power.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, because then they do ride into battle, and this is where the two stories come back together with a great battle of the Empire line and the Kislevites put up their defense, and they will bring Sirtha Lenk is the warlord, the Krang, who's sort of leading this spring driving this initial invasion on behalf of Archeon, who's going to come later. This is just an invasion to kick up a fuss and burn down some settlements. So we do get the two opposing characters end up on different sides of this battle. And actually, this is probably a good moment to just ask this question. I wonder, Stu, like, because there's a certain level of realism. I mean, obviously, we're talking about chaos gods and gifts and all of this sort of stuff. That, you know, it's fantasy through and through, but also there's a lot of effort, I think, given to, well, this is how the units work and the armies work, and the sort of, you know, to ground the story. There's a couple of mentions of dragons in the sky or winged beasts and that kind of thing. But for the most part, even the chaos shamans and their rituals, there's not a lot of tangible magic. So they do all of these sacrifices to get the blessings of Khorne or Tzeentch or any other chaos god. But we only really see it in a few small ways, like, you know, being able to understand the language or being able to see without eyes, those kinds of things. We don't see the sort of epic battle magic that you see on the Warhammer tabletop. How did you feel about that sort of version of magic in this world, in this story?
I think it added to the real. I think it works because of the two main protagonists in terms of chaos and humans, essentially, of the Empire stroke Kislev. It gives the opportunity to keep it more of a lower fantasy, to really bring in some of that kind of ancient Britain's Druidic Norseman kind of feel to relation to gods. It doesn't really, it's almost funny that it could read like a historical battle, But the funny thing is, you're thinking, oh, those gods that they're praying to, well, they're actually real in this story.
Yeah.
Whereas you could have the same text and replace it with Norsemen or ancient Britons and Druids, and you know that they believe it.
Yeah.
But it isn't true, and that's the key thing. Is it's about their belief. I think.
Yeah.
So it becomes irrelevant because
Yeah.
the characters believe that that's what's important. There is some magical.
There is, yeah. There are a
there?
few moments
Like
of particularly
the
important.
water freezing at the end, which is quite important. So it's there, but it's subtle enough that it's not like the end times books. If you've ever read any of those, where that's quite overt and in your face, this is much more sort of subtle. It's there, but it's not the most important part of the story, and I don't think it matters. I don't think it detracts. I think it's there.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's missing.
It's actually one of the reasons I really loved it, I think, as well, because of the nature of this as the start of an end times. So we're starting from the lowest fantasy. These are these are chaos armies. They do worship the gods. They do have the blessings of the gods, but they're not the armies that have got all of the biggest, baddest dragons and sorcerers and all that. That's all still to come. This is literally just the start of it. So these Cirtha Lenk's army was never going to be the one that destroys the empire, and Archaon knew that. Arguably Cirtha Lenk knows that as well. So all of these guys, I'm sure there were sorcerers and shamans doing stuff, but then sort of on the periphery, they're not relevant to the story we're reading about. But it still works because this is the beginning of the escalation. We're going to see all of that come later on. And for us right now, we're just getting the swordsmen, the infantry, the warlords who don't have access to those cool tools. So they are having to use what they've got, which is the sort of brutality and the kind of creativity of the Kislevites and the blessing of Tzeentch through being really good with a sword, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I summed it up completely. And I suppose we've hinted at quite a lot of them about the end. We know that they're matching up. These two units end up matching up against each other on the battlefield. And I don't know, did you expect that to happen or not? Is that?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because so earlier on I did. It sort of feels inevitable that these two guys are going to have to come face to face at some point because you started with them face to face. So there's got to be some sort of resolution to that. However, because we're getting quite late in the book, I did wonder if it was going to just end with these are both now prominent members of these cultures and these societies, and they've both abandoned their original starting points and the empire, and they're now fighting for their sort of found families in a way. But then, you get that, we talked about the magical freezing of the water. There's a really, really good bit when it looks like the Empire are just going to easily win the day because they've got all of these cannons on these hills. They can just sit there and fire. There's a river in the way, and the Chaos Marauders, the Northers, are struggling to get over the river, and they're all just getting shot. So then we do get the hand of Tzeentch playing a major role. He freezes the whole river almost instantly so that the army can just march straight over it, charge straight over it. And then that's when you get to that point where Vollen on one side, and then we've got Gerlach on the other side, and they ride into battle together, right?
Yeah. And they're two groups of heroes. They're fighting each other, and you see supporting characters, I suppose, on both sides dying in this battle. I thought it was quite clever the way it was relatively quick. I quite like that. So the battle, so the wider war scenes, this is a slight tangent, but the wider battle scenes are big, but the individual fights are short. They're realistic. Real sword fights don't go on like they do in some films, and they go on forever and ever and ever, and it is brutal. Usually a few swipes and someone's going to get killed, and it feels like that in these key moments. But so they end up sort of charging in together, and it's Carl's Tzeentch powers enables him to recognize um, Gerlach, and because Gerlach doesn't recognize Carl at all anymore. He's
Mm.
got a helm on. He's completely changed. But there's a moment where Carl recognizes, and it's that moment that he hesitates because he recognizes them.
Yeah.
That probably gives Gerlach the time to kill Carl. And then there's point after that when Gerlach recognizes Carl with the helmet's off, that he thinks to himself, if I'd known that beforehand,
Mm.
would I have hesitated? And so they're sort of playing off those moments, and it's almost like Zinch being tricksy. He would have known, but it's almost like the powers of Zinch there that enabled him to recognize him was the fall, was the downfall of him.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
that moment, we made him hesitate, where he could have struck first. So it's almost, well, tricksy Zinch, whether that's deliberate Zinch laughing away at it
Yeah.
or not, or whether it was just kind of a consequence of those powers. Who knows? Just one of those luck of the draw, so to speak. But
Yeah.
that's what Zinch is, I suppose, isn't it? That kind of tricks.
Yeah, I liked it. Yeah, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would Zinch do that? Because and Volan even sort of thinks to himself, or Aziat Zine as he is at this point, he thinks to himself, why didn't Zinch tell me that? Like, I've seen loads of stuff that might happen in the future. Why did he not give me this? And obviously, yeah, the hesitation costs him his life. And we know that Cirtha Lenk and the entire army get defeated by the Empire. So maybe it was just that had come to the end of its run, and Zinch had sort of had some fun and watched this adventure that this person had been through, and the change, because that's literally the point that Zinch wants, is changing from being alive to being dead. That is a big change, and Zinch is quite happy with it. So maybe that's achieved its goal for him, or it.
It's just, I suppose, but it was the first of, like you've alluded to, it's the beginning of a large war, first of many waves. This is the vanguard, the raiding Norsca, which raid normally anyway. Send them first forward en masse. This is the first stage of a long and nearly world-ending war, which doesn't exist anymore, but sort of does in some of our hearts. And I think it was it's slightly odd that Gerlach just seems to kind of ride off into the distance. I'm not sure that that's the only part of the thing. I'm not sure that was needed, especially as you kind of agree. It feels like he's met his love as well in Kislev. The Alexandra, it was mentioned in the last sort of chapter before the end. You feel like he would go back with the men and maybe become the leader of the little group now, because of the death of so many. But he doesn't. He kind of goes off. So it makes you wonder whether the plan was maybe to have him doing something else. So that's the only part of the whole story I thought, just felt a little bit of a strange, but it's like a last line, isn't it? It's not really a...
Yeah, it is. I agree. It does seem a bit odd, because that's when the clouds, and seeing the same cloud again. He says that he's seen it, and now he's going to ride off. And yeah, it is a bit odd, but I guess it may be a little bit of a rushed version of kind of saying, listen, this guy, when we met him at the start of the book, which is only a year earlier in the timeline, but when we met him, he was a young man. He was eager for war. He was eager to prove himself. He didn't really understand the cost of any of that. Now he fully understands it all, and he's seen so much and experienced so much that he now knows he can never be that guy again. But he also doesn't belong with the Kislevites. He's sort of a man with no world now.
So an end to that. I suppose both characters have an end to their journeys in the book
with those
otherwise
that they've joined.
One would have otherwise. So
yeah, so maybe it's more metaphorical. I mean, there's an interesting thing with the way that the Kislev burials worked for the Lancers, is that they would just sort of put the body on the horse and then send the horse off just in a straight line, and it'll go wherever it goes. And they even do that when someone is injured or poisoned, and it's kind of like, let the wilderness decide whether they survive or not. That ultimately ends up helping Gerlach out at one point, because he comes across a guy who they sent out earlier who has survived, and then they have a little adventure. But that's kind of the end for Gerlach, is like, well, I'm just going to ride off in a straight line and the wilderness is going to do what it's going to do to me. So
Yeah,
it is
yeah. I
maybe a
think
bit
it's.
rushed and a bit.
I
It
think,
doesn't
yeah, you're probably
land
right. That's probably what it was
perfectly.
trying to symbolize.
I
Maybe
think
just running out of
so.
word count. The last couple of chapters are a little bit shorter, weren't they? It's like,
It does. Yeah. I mean, it felt. I would have been very happy if the book had ended with, okay, now Volan has accepted the name as Yatzin, and he's fully gone chaos,
yeah,
and Gerlach has decided he's going to ride with the Kislevites
Mm.
back into the fray, and that's the end of the story. That would have been enough of a journey for me to be satisfied on both counts,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I would have loved to have seen a sequel and see where it went. Because I just enjoyed the book so much. I enjoyed reading it and sort of thinking about it and being in this version of the world. And it's a prelude to something larger. You know, what's to come with the rest of the Storm of Chaos. I think it's incredibly effective. I think it works so well to sort of say,
Mm.
look, this is just the start of how bad things are going to get for the Empire. Now, I'd love to know, and I've been trying to find out. I would love to know how much was known during the writing of this book about what was intended for the Storm of Chaos. I mean, it's mentioned here, so it definitely is known about.
Mm.
But what were the specific details that Abnett was working towards, or did he just have free reign and they sort of retrofit it for it? Was that the reason characters couldn't survive? Because even Cirtha Lenk, who, and I've joked a bit about, the general, the overall warlord, the High Czar of the Chaos Forces, is a suit of armor with then like a mutated Chaos belly that has a face and a high pitched voice. And so I can only assume that Abnett is really saying, look, it's Krang, it's Fantasy Krang from
Yeah.
Turtles. And it's great fun. It sounds silly, but it works really well. It's only in a scene, I think. Still has a level of threat and presence that's really effective, but it's the kind of goofy, fun chaos mutation stuff from Realm of
Yeah.
Chaos. So it works perfectly for this world. I also think Cirtha Lenk is a brilliant name, and this
Uh-huh.
is their only appearance. So
Yeah.
they're mentioned in the history books because of the campaign that they lead in this book. But we don't get to see anything else. There's never been a miniature of Cirtha Lenk, and it's a shame because I think there's stuff here that I would
Well,
have
there's
loved
room
to have
there.
seen.
Maybe when it's like this, is room there for the tabletop gamer.
Yeah, but
Go and build that. Go and
I
make
mean,
it.
I'd love it. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I think overall, I was really pleased with this as a book. I think it's just a really, really good fantasy story. We've not even touched really on Beledni, the leader of the Kislevite Winged Lancers, who's so nice to Gerlach and is so understanding, but he's also not a pushover, and he's deserving of the respect he gets from his men. He has quite a poignant death later on. I was really sad about it. I wanted him to survive. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but I think that's again just this the quality of the writing and the characterization is great. It's just good. It's a really
It's
good
good.
book.
He is. Abnett's good. You
Yeah,
need
he's
to read
really
more.
good.
You really do.
He's really
You
good.
really do.
So, yeah. I mean, have you got any
This is what
final
they're all like.
thoughts?
Honestly, Jordan, this is what they're all like. You got a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. I'm excited to read more Abnett for sure. I don't know if he did much more Warhammer Fantasy fiction. I'm gonna have to double check. I know he did some. There's a couple of short stories he's written here
Mm.
and there, but I don't know that he did any more full length novels. So I'll have to double check that.
He may have.
Speaking of,
I didn't read an awful lot of fantasy fiction from this era myself, to be honest with you.
well,
A bit like you, returned to it later on. Sorry, you were going to say.
I was just going to say one
Rudely
of the
interrupted
one of the short stories he did write is actually a prequel to this. So
you.
it was
Yeah.
included in the Chaos Rising booklet that was given away with White Dwarf.
Right.
Again, to sort of herald the start of the Storm of Chaos event and this big story in the Warhammer world that was going to be the massive invasion that Archaon is leading into the Empire. So there is a story that basically tells the tale of another one of the sort of the smaller clans within the Chaos Marauders army, and how there is a sort of competition, I suppose, to become the Shia Tsar. So the Tsar is the warlord name. There's a High Tsar who's Sirtha Lenk, who's in charge. The Shia Tsar is kind of like the sort of spiritual Tsar, the sort of most important Tsar of the Chaos Marauders army. So it's what they have to do, all of the different competing Tsars, what they have to do in order to actually become the Shia Tsar. And it's only a short story, and it's totally inessential for reading Riders of the Dead. But again, it just adds a little bit more to the culture of the Tsars and the Chaos Warriors, the Marauders. You get a little bit more about their religion and how it all works together. There's a bit more. There's a monstrous beast in it, which is fun. So there's a little bit more of the magical stuff and the fantasy elements.
I'll have to dig that out and have a look.
It's worth a read. I enjoy it. I mean, it's as well written as everything else. Again, within a very small span of pages, he's able to give real character to some of these Chaos Marauders. There's a few references to characters who turn up in Rise of the Dead as well. So there's some good stuff in there. Yeah, it's worth a read. Essential.
Well, with anyone who's embarking on Warriors of Chaos for the old world at the moment, especially the Army of Infamy, which is Norska based, I'd say that this book is essential, influential reading in terms of giving you some ideas of flavors and concepts and things. So
yeah, so much stuff, so much inspiration to draw, and a real exciting, compelling story. It does a great job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think as a novel, I think we're both in agreement that it's a terrific read. As a sort of piece of fiction within the Storm of Chaos, I think it does a great job of setting things up and kind of establishing the scale of the threat of what's to come later on. And it's a version of the Warhammer world that is really enjoyable and is well worth revisiting, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's definitely go and read it. If you like your chaos stuff, you will love it.
Yeah. So I think we'll leave it there then, Stu. I mean, this was just a bonus book club, but we'll be back for our regular book club where we're continuing to read the original GW books. So these were the books that were published between 89 and 91. So there were 17 novels and short story anthologies. Some of them fantasy, some of them 40k, some of them dark future as well. So that book club continues, and we'll be back with that. Who knows? If people enjoy this, we might come back and do another bonus book club. We've done another bonus book club about Skaven Slayer, the Gotrek and Felix stories. So we're up for these. I think, you know, when we're called to arms, we'll grab a book and give it a read and talk about it. But in the meantime, Stu, where can people find you online?
Miniature Realms, mostly on YouTube, because all the other stuff just kind of feeds into the YouTube, really. But Miniature Realms for lots of different stuff, a lot of old world related stuff at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put those links in the description down below. You can find my links as well. All of the social medias, Patreon, Discord, all that sort of good stuff. But yeah, for now, I think let's leave it there. And this is Jordan Sorcery and the GW Books Club. So thank you everybody for joining us.